Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 8 from Biosphere, End Plants. So here we are, what I believe to be the last great Biosphere album. Well, I haven't heard Central recordings yet, that might surprise me, but yes. This is a strange point in the Biosphere story. When I first saw the title years ago, I was expecting something kind of more naturalistic sounding, or maybe I thought it'd end up somewhere in the carbon-based lifeforms ballpark, but I had misunderstood the title and thought the album was about plants. Then I figured out what that N meant, and as it turns out, N is for nuclear. Nuclear plants. This album is a concept album meant to capture the atmosphere of a Japanese nuclear power plant. Gotta admit, not your everyday concept for a Biosphere album, or for an album in general. I will say though, despite the unique concept that I've not really seen anything like, it actually took quite a bit of deliberation deciding whether or not I thought this album truly qualified as great. Because I do have my issues with it. Well, mainly one in particular, and it's that I don't think this album, just from a sonic perspective, does much that Biosphere didn't already do before. Just in terms of what musical ingredients go into this album, it's pretty similar to the early microgravity days. Very simplistic and fairly run-of-the-mill IDM synth sounds and drum patterns with simple melodies and a couple of voice samples here and there. If you are open to go into this album hearing something you've never heard before, I don't think End Plants really delivers that. But there's just something about this one. It has the same ingredients as Microgravity, but it has a very different vibe that's hard to pin down. That album reminded me of old, outdated VHS documentaries about space. This really doesn't feel spacey at all. It feels extremely sterile and vacuum-packed, and like it's trying to be comforting in some way, but everything is just a little bit off. It sounds like the background music to a science documentary of some kind. It's very subtle the way it goes about things, but it still feels like a warning. Like, it all looks fine and pristine right now, but we're dealing with dangerous chemicals right here, and specifically this big futuristic facility is built in Japan where you're prone to earthquakes and tsunamis. Are we truly safe? Oh yeah, and just a few weeks before the album was released, and technically after he had already finished the album, the Fukushima nuclear disaster happened. So, yeah, kind of a disquieting album, to say the least. But I also think I'd just barely give this album the edge over Microgravity as well, not just because of the more unique and out-of-the-box concepts that unintentionally predicted the future, but despite containing so many similar synth tones, this album doesn't feel dated to me. Yeah, that's the other weird thing about this album. It doesn't scream 90s. You'd think it would, given the retro 808-tinged drum machines, the simplistic early IDM-ish synth tones, some of those Mellotron-esque pads that appear in some parts that also appeared in parts of his first two albums, but no. I think it might have something to do just with the sonic clarity. Like, the production on this is super clean and polished and way better balanced than on the first two albums. It doesn't sound cheap like those did. It's an upgrade from, like, some old documentary and VHS and 4:3 aspect ratio into a documentary and digital video with full 1080p resolution. The bass tones are really rich and deep. The melodic textures are quite spacious and pristine. Everything looks like it should be working properly. But that cleaner production makes these pieces even spookier, just creating that really subtle sense of something being just the slightest hint off. The first two albums' attempts at a darker sound, as good as they are, seem almost hokey by comparison. It's hard to describe, really. I also think this album has more in the way of replay value than the first two. There are a couple of choice moments here and there that I got kinda sick of with repeat listens, mainly the 2-minute interlude in the middle, Manju 1, which kind of has this lo-fi sample of a rambling Japanese woman. I can't really understand what she's saying, and the sound of her voice got kinda tedious as I listened to this more and more. And the track Ikata 1, while that track has some very nice calming melodic progressions in the beginning that remind me of coming out of a hospital, it also has these really squelchy and grating bassy synth pads later on that sound like there's some kind of electrical failure going on in another room. I mean, when I describe it like that, it's easy to see how a track like this fits well into the concept of the album, giving off that sense of, pay no attention to that buzzing, everything is going fine. But it still could have been blended better. Those electrical surge synths feel kind of awkwardly placed and cut in the mix in a less than subtle way. While I'm at it, the track Sendai 1 is kind of an underwhelming opener for me too. Not a bad opener or one that feels unfitting or out of place, mainly consisting of all these subtle and calm-pitched clanging noises and this one subtle squealing pad in the background that sounds like you need your air conditioning fixed. Again, you can see how a track like this makes sense on this album. I just think it might have been better placed later on in the album. Like, it's very sterile and unemotional and isn't particularly attention-grabbing in the way it goes about it, and might have worked better as something to flesh out the unnerving atmosphere of the album rather than be a tone setter. But most tracks on here I didn't really get sick of much. Shika 1 has some cool laid-back harmonies and light mechanical percussion that was always nice, and it made a cool contrast with the more menacing Joyo, which had all these steamy sound effects alongside its darker synth pad and melodies and Mellotron-esque pads flying over everything, really adding into that dense, steamy feel. Also, I may not be huge on Manju 1, but Manju 2 was a nice little bubbly melodic piece near the end that was a cool addition. But all that said, the points at which this album puts its melodies into the focus and go for a slightly more conventional sound are actually probably the strongest moments on here. Unquestionably, my favorite track in the bunch was Genkai 1. A simple, steady-paced track with a slow-building bass line and the return of those Mellotron-ish pads with these plinky melodies going through everything and a surprisingly catchy chord progression, too. This track always pulls me in every time I put this thing on. And there's other similar tracks like the more energetic Oi 1. Actually has very similar melodies and bass line, but the beat is more fast-paced, there's more squeaky effects going around, too. Certainly feels enough like its own thing to also be a big highlight. And the closer, Fujiko, has some other vacuum-packed, claustrophobic synth blends, but applied to some strangely calming melodic progressions. And it also has this Japanese guy talking in the beginning, which I'm less keen on, but it kind of reminds me of the Russian voice on Koparizia. Like, it's there, but it's not intrusive. Oh yeah, and the bonus track on his Bandcamp page, Oma, also has a calming and deep synth progression in 6/8 time and featuring an interesting breakbeat going underneath it. That's another nice one. So yeah, overall, this album is hardly perfect or really pulls me in at a consistent rate, but its unique, well-executed concept and its place in the Biosphere catalog just barely allowed it to pass into great territory. I can understand if some people thought it was too plain for their tastes. It certainly was for me on a couple of these listens. You could say it was too minimalistic and repetitive for your liking, though you could also say that about literally any Biosphere album. It's still part of his appeal as always. But there's just always been something about it that I still find appealing and that prevented it from wearing out its welcome even on repeat listens. I don't know, it's right on the border between good and great, and I'm not sure how much I would have praised this if it had come from a different artist who didn't have as varied a history as Jansen, or if I didn't know it was taking inspiration from as unlikely a source as nuclear power plants. But anytime I've put this album on, I've really enjoyed it and got something out of it that I don't think I can get anywhere else, so with that in mind, I think this album just barely skates by with a solid 8 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.